Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah shir. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav, and we will be learning tonight Mirz Hashem Daf Tzadik Aleph Amid Beis. We're continuing to learn halachos Sukkah, and we're beginning a brand new Siman today on the top line of Tzadik Aleph Amid Beis. Siman Taf Reish Lamed Dine Defanois HaSukkah, the halachos that pertain to the walls of the Sukkah. In the last Siman, we discussed the halachos of the Schach, the halachos that pertain to the covering of the Sukkah. Now we're going to discuss the halachos that pertain to the walls of the Sukkah. Ubai Yud Gimel Seifim, and here we have 13 Seifim. Says the Mechaber in Sif Aleph, Kol HaDevarim Kisherim LaDefanois. All sorts of materials are kosher for use in the walls of the Sukkah. Says the Mishnah Berurah Cotton Aleph, Kisherim LaDefanois, the mashmois hakasav, because the implication of the pasuk that says da Sukkah is taseh ba'osbecha migarnecha umiyikvecha. This is a pasuk that we've discussed already several times while we're learning halachos Sukkah, and that is the pasuk tells us that you make the Sukkah ba'osbecha when you gather migarnecha from your threshing floor umiyikvecha and from your wine vat. And the Chavetz Chaim explains here in the brackets, as we've mentioned already several times, we learn out from this pasuk, the Yasa HaSukkah, that we're supposed to make the Sukkah mi psoiles geired vayekev, from the leftovers, from the psoiles, from the garbage kind of, that's left over from the threshing floor and the wine vat. Tehu davar she'ein mekabel tuma v'gidulai min haaretz, which is a reference to materials that are not mekabel tuma and that tzaymeach min ha'adama, they grow from the ground. Now, what's that speaking about? What is the psoilis? What are the leftovers of the goyrin and the yekev? Well, when you bring your grain to the threshing floor, you're bringing all sorts of material. You're bringing grain on stalks. You're bringing grain together with its chaff. And now you're doing the threshing. By the time you're finished with the threshing, you've removed the usable, the edible grain from the rest of the stalk, from the rest of the chaff. And now you're left with the psoilis. You're left with the stalks. You're left with chaff. That's the psoilis. That's the leftovers of the threshing floor. Those are things, those are items that are tzemeach min ha'adama. They grow from the ground and they're not mekabel tumah. So too, what is the psoilis of the yekev? What's the leftovers from the wine vat? You bring your grapes to press the grapes into wine. So you have the clusters, the woody clusters that the grapes grow on. You have the branches that the clusters hang from. You're going to separate the grapes from all of these materials, and you're going to use the grapes to make the wine. But you have the psoilis, you have the branches and the woody clusters that are left over. That's the psoilis from the yekev. Again, this is stuff that's not mekabel tumah, and it's stuff that's tzemeach min ha'adama. So it's from this pasuk of mipsoilis of migarnecha umiyikvecha that we learned out the requirements of schach. That schach has to be tzemeach min ha'adama, and schach has to be something that's not royal kabel tumah. Does that apply to the walls? So the Chavetz Chaim says no. Kaya schach dafka. That pasuk is only referring to the schach of the sukkah. The defanois loy ikri sukkah, because we do not call the walls sukkah. The word sukkah is a reference specifically to the schach. So when the pasuk says Sukkah is taseh ba'osbecha migarnecha miyikvecha, that means that the sukkah, the ikar of the sukkah, which is the schach, that's what has to come from the psoilis goyrin v'yekev, not the walls. Now let's go back to the Shulchan Aruch. The words of the Ramah in the parentheses here, Ve'ein tzarech lahamidam derech gidilosam. There is no need, if you're using something which is tzemeach min ha'adama, let's say you're going to fashion the walls of your sukkah out of planks of wood that you're going to cut from a tree trunk. The Ramah tells us here, there is no need to erect those walls derech gidilosam. Don't think that you had a tree that was standing upright. This was the bottom of the tree. This was the top of the tree. Don't think that you have to erect the planks in the manner in which they grew from the ground, so that it's vertical, the bottom is on the bottom, and the top is on the top. No, you could turn it upside down and you could put the top on the bottom. You could turn them horizontal and you could use the tree in a horizontal fashion. There's no need to put it up in the way in which it grew from the ground. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ice cotton bays, vein tzarich lahamidam, hainu. What the Ramah is telling us over here, you might be wondering, why on earth would I think that you do have to do it derech gedilasan? Where did this concept come from? So the Chafetz Chaim explains to us a little bit. He says, hainu doloi midaminon in yonenu. We do not compare the topic at hand over here, where we're talking about the walls of a sukkah. We don't compare the halacha of the walls of a sukkah, lululav, to the halacha of a lulav. The be'inon, when it comes to a lulav and an esrig, we require sheyia likichasai derech gedilasai. When you take the lulav and the esrig, you have to hold them in the manner in which they grow from the ground. We all know that when we take the lulav and esrig, we always have that shiloh. Yitz Hashem will learn this soon. When you pick up the lulav and esrig, right away you're mekayim the mitzvah. So how do I make the bracha? To make the bracha while the lulav and esrig are sitting on the table, that creates a certain amount of a hefsek between the bracha and the kiyam hamitzvah, which we always want to keep as short as possible. So what we actually do is, we pick up the lulav and the esrig, and we hold the esrig upside down. As long as we hold the esrig upside down, with the pitim pointing down to the ground and the ukitz pointing up, we're not yotze the mitzvah. So even though we're holding the lulav and esrig, we're not yotze the mitzvah yet. Then we make the bracha on the tilas lulav. Then we flip the esrig over. Now we could be yotze the mitzvah. Why aren't we yotze the mitzvah while the esrig is upside down? Because the halacha is that the lekicha of the daled minim has to be derech giduloi. We have to hold them in the way that they grow from the ground. So the top has to be pointing up, the bottom pointing down. Same thing with the lulav. If you would hold the lulav upside down, you wouldn't be yotze. Says the Chafetz Chaim, this Ramah that says that we could erect the walls of the sukkah and there's no need lahamidam derech gedilasan, is telling me don't think that we compare it to the halacha of the daled minim. Kidal kamon siman tafresh nun aleph sif beis. Don't think that we have the same requirement here as we do there. Now the truth is, this is very interesting. Why is it that we don't have this requirement? How come we have this requirement by the daled minim and we don't have this requirement over here by the walls of the sukkah? So there is a Berurah hagra. The gra says the reason this halacha doesn't apply to the walls of the sukkah is because you're not required to build the walls of the sukkah out of something that's tzaimeach min ha'adama. Many of us have sukkah walls that are made out of fiberglass. So these are man-made materials. Since there's no requirement to use something that's tzaimeach min ha'adama, there's no requirement that it has to be put up derech gedilasan. However, if the requirement would be, let's say we would have a halacha that you're mechuyev to make the walls of a sukkah from planks of wood that are tzaimeach min ha'adama, that would come along with the requirement that it has to be put up derech gedilasan. Okay, that gra now could make you ask the following question. If that's true, then how about schach? By schach we have a requirement that has to be tzamech min ha'adama. So by schach do we have a requirement that the schach has to be put up derech gedilasan? And if you'll tell me that schach does have to be put up derech gedilasan, but wait a second, our schach is horizontal, our schach is not vertical. So if we use bamboo poles, bamboo grows pointing straight up, it grows vertical. How could we use bamboo poles and lay them down horizontal on top of the sukkah if it's a requirement that they meet tzamech min ha'adama, and that brings together with it a requirement of derech gedilasan? So there are those that answer that question by saying that when it comes to things like bamboo poles, it actually is considered derech gedilasan to lay them down horizontally. Why? Because when it comes to trees, it's hard to say that horizontal is not derech gedilasan, because a tree has a trunk, but it also has branches. And we know that the branches literally branch out in all different directions. Sometimes the branches go up, sometimes they're at a 45-degree angle, sometimes they're mamish horizontal, sometimes branches come and they're even pointing down. So when it comes to things like trees, it's hard to say that horizontal is not derech gedilasan. Others want to make a chilik and they want to say that this requirement doesn't apply to schach, even though it's something which is semech ben ha'adama. But in any case, you see how over here, a little ramah, vein tzarich lahamidam derech gedilasan, and a short little chavetz chaim over here in Siv Beis brings up actually a lot of very interesting ideas and very interesting concepts. Now we go back to the Shulchan Aruch, top line, last word. Va'afilu chamasa meruba mitzilasa machmas hadafanois keshera. Even if the sukkah, we know, we learned by schach that one of the key requirements of schach is the schach has to give more shade than it allows in sunlight. So the schach has to be tzilasa meruba mechamasa. It has to be more shade than sun. Says the mechaber over here, the sukkah itself does not necessarily have to be tzilasa meruba mechamasa. If the walls of the sukkah have very large openings in them, now we'll have to discuss how large, what kind of openings you can have in the walls so that the walls are still considered continuous walls and we have a sukkah with the proper amount of walls. We'll have to get there. But let's say we have a sukkah that has significant openings in the walls, and because of those openings, a lot of sunlight gets in. Not through the schach, the sunlight is coming in through the sides of the sukkah. In that case, the sukkah is still kosher. So what the mechaber is pointing out over here is the requirement of tzilasa beruba mechamasa is a requirement on the schach. It's not a requirement on the walls, and it's not a factual requirement on the sukkah itself. Bottom line, at the end of the day, the sukkah may have more sunlight in it than shade, as long as the sunlight is coming in through the walls and not through the schach. Says the Mishnah Berurah cut in Gimel, Va'afilu chamasa meruba, hainu shahayu pertzais gedolos badafanois. You might have very large, significant breaches in the walls of the sukkah, shal yidei zachamasa meruba misilasa, and because of that, factually the sukkah itself has more sunlight than shade in it. Mikamakim kshera. Nevertheless, this sukkah is kosher. The chol zeh lo kamtinon ela b'schach, because the whole kipeda of tzilasa meruba mechamasa is only a kpeda on the schach. It's not a kpeda on the defanis. Says the Ramah, second line down. Haga mikamakayim. Nevertheless, while the mechaber and the Ramah have been telling you over here that there are significantly less requirements when it comes to the construction of the walls than there is on the schach. You could use all sorts of materials. It doesn't have to be derech gedilasan. It could be chamasa meruba mitzalasa. Mikamakim, nevertheless, says the Ramah, lo yasa hadafanois midavar shareicha ra. You should make sure not to make the walls out of something that is malodorous, something that has a bad smell. Oy davar shebisyabesh tarich shiva, or to construct the walls out of a material that will dry out and shrivel over the 7 days of Yom Tov, v'lo yehei bo shir mechitza, which would result in the walls not having the minimal measurements of a mechitza. We're going to learn that the walls have to have a minimal size. The walls have to be at least 10 tvachim tall. The wall of the sukkah is going to have to be zayin by zayin. 7 tvachim by 7 tvachim is the minimum size of a sukkah. So we do have minimum shiurim of the walls. If you're going to construct the walls out of materials that are going to shrivel up and shrink or shrivel up and crumble over the 7 days of Sukkot, so that it's not going to be a kosher or mechitza, so then the same halacha that we learned by schach comes into play. By schach we said, if the schach is going to shrivel up and dry out and fall apart during the 7 days of Sukkot, then even when it's whole, it's not kosher. Even though you look up and right now it looks like beautiful schach, we need a sukkah's tasa l'chas shiva yamim. We need a sukkah that's going to last for 7 days. If this is a sukkah that's going to shrivel up and dry out during the 7 days, it's not a kosher sukkah. That applies both to the schach and to the defanos. Says the Mishnah Berurah cut in Dalet, midavar shereicha ra. you should make sure not to make the walls of the sukkah out of a malodorous material. Explains the Chavetz Chaim why is that. The Chayshinon, because we must be concerned. Shema makmazeh yetze min hasukkah. This is the same halacha that we learned by the schach. We said you can't make the schach lechatchila. It's a din d'Rabbanan. Lechatchila, you can't make the schach out of something that has a very bad smell, because we're afraid you're going to get driven out of the sukkah by the smell. V'diyeved shaper dami af b'schach. However, b'diyeved, we learned earlier that even if you did make the schach out of something malodorous, b'diyeved you could use the sukkah. Unless it's such a bad smell that a person pashut can't stand it. If it's such a bad smell that you're going to gag if you breathe in, so your pashut can't stay in the sukkah, then the sukkah is pasal midaraisa. After the pasal min HaTorah, to be inon teishvu kein taduru. Now you have a problem. We know that one of the key requirements of sukkah is teishvu kein taduru. The diras haroy of the sukkah, you have to be able to live in it the same way you live in your diras kva in your house. You would leave your house if your house was so malodorous that your pasha could gag and you can't stand the smell. So that would render the sukkah possibly pasal midaraisa. So basically we have this halacha. The halacha would be the same both by the schach and the walls. And that is that lechatchila, you should not make the schach or the walls out of something that has an unpleasant smell, because we're afraid that smell is going to drive you out of the sukkah. However, b'di'eved, if you did make the schach out of something that's malodorous, or you did make the walls out of something malodorous, then b'di'eved the sukkah is kosher, unless you used something that has such a terrible smell, it has such a stench, that you pashut can't be soivel it. In that case, whether it's the schach or the walls, it's possible that the sukkah would be pasal midaraisa. Continues the Chavetz Chaim in the middle of Eis Katan Dalet. Oid Kosav. The Pri Megadim also writes, Oisan she'oisin sukkah eitzel beis hakisei v'ashpa. Those people who put up a sukkah or a refuse dump. They put up a sukkah near a beis hakisei, in close proximity to a beis hakisei or to a refuse dump. Let's remember. Let's remember that in years gone by, people had an outhouse out in the backyard. They had a refuse dump out in the backyard. They didn't have tremendous properties. Where are they going to erect the sukkah? Sometimes they had to erect the sukkah somewhere between the back of the house and the beis hakisei, the outhouse, or somewhere near a refuse dump. And both the beis hakisei and the refuse dump could have a very, very unpleasant smell. So Oid Kasav, the Pri Megadim also writes, Oisan she'oisin sukkah eitzel beis hakisei, those who put up a sukkah near a beis hakisei, va'ashpa, or near a malodorous refuse dump, mipnei shehamakom tzar lehem, because they simply don't have a lot of space, and that's the only space that they have. V'reach ra magia aleihem, and now the bad smell of the ashpa or of the beis hakisei reaches the sukkah. Min HaTorah yoytze yedei chayvasai. If it's not a smell, if it's not a stench that's so bad that you pasha can't tolerate it, you are yoytze b'di'eved. Min HaTorah, midaraisa, you're yoytze yedei chayvasai. Aval, however, lo yivarech berkas hamazayin sham. But you're not going to be allowed to bench inside this sukkah, right? Because when you have a reach ra of a beis hakisei, we have a din v'haya machanecha kadosh, the big machlokes rishonim, which is referred to over here actually in the parentheses. K'dela'el siman ayin tesif beis ayin sham b'dei rishonim shapasku keino achreinim. The machlokes rishonim followed up by machlokes achreinim. Exactly the halachos of saying a davar shebekdusha in the presence of a reach ra. Either we learned it out from the pasuk of Yihi machanecha kadosh, that your encampment has to be kadosh, where a yid lives. Especially a yid he's going to be mispal. A yid is going to learn Torah. A yid is going to make brachas. He has to be able to recite Dvar Moshe B'Kedusha. You need a machanecha kadosh. Your encampment, your home, has to be kadosh. It has to have a level of kedusha. Something that has a malodorous smell, that is not v'haya machanecha kadosh, and that would prevent you from making brachas of saying Dvar Moshe B'Kedusha. Others learn it out from the pasuk of L'yir b'cha ervas davar. And there are nafkaminas and halacha where you learn it from. So in any case, the Mishnah Berurah says over here, while it's true that midaraisa you could be yotze your chiyuv of sukkah if the sukkah is in close proximity to a beis hakisei or to a refuse dump, even if there's a malodorous, terrible smell, not terrible smell, a bad smell. If it's terrible, if you can't be sivalent, then you're not yotze. But remember, you're not going to be able to recite Birkas Hamazon in this sukkah because it's too close to the beis hakisei. Now, this in the parentheses where he says here, "Ayin sham b'der rishayna shapasku keino achrayim," there's a machlokes rishonim. Let's say you're in close proximity to a beis hakisei or to tzaya or to excrement, but the excrement or the beis hakisei, they're in a different room, so you could see it, perhaps you could even smell it, but it's a different room. There's a machlokes, the Rashba and the Rush, whether or not the fact that it's in a different room, whether that allows you to recite Birkas Hamazon or any other type of davar shebektusha. That's followed up by a machlokes achrayim. There are those that say that the machlokes, the Rashba and the Rush, is only in a case where the smell is not reaching you. But if the smell is reaching you, then both shitas, both the Rush and the Rashba, would agree that you still cannot recite the davar shebektusha. There are other achrayim that say no. The whole machlokes, the Rush and the Rashba, the machlokes Rush and the Rashba is even if the bad smell is reaching you. There are those rishonim that hold that if it's in a different cheder, if it's in a different room, then even if the smell reaches you, it's still okay. But in any case, the Mishnah Berurah tells us here that we are machmir. Kedei rishayna shapasku keino achrayim. We're machmir, and we say that as long as the beis hakisei is within a line of sight, if you could just see the beis hakisei, the walls of an outhouse have a din of tzaya, because the walls of an outhouse would be saturated with tzaya and with urine, and therefore the walls of the outhouse themselves have a din of tzaya. And if the outhouse is within line of sight, if you could see it from the sukkah, even if you can't smell it, you cannot recite Birkas Hamazon. Continues the Chavetz Chaim, he says if you have another location where you can build the sukkah, certainly you should not make the sukkah in close proximity to an outhouse or to a refuse dump. If the odor is not reaching you, but the beis hakisei is in your line of sight, if you could see it, gam kein aser, like I spoke out, it's still forbidden. Okay. Now we go to Sif Bey. Sif Hey. Ice cut and hay in the Mishnah Berurah. Ay davar shemisyavesh. The Ramah said you should not make the walls out of something that has a reach ra, or out of something that's going to dry and shrivel up. Ritzayna loymar, what the Ramah wants to say is, dainina leikilu kvar nisyavesh. Like I spoke out when we read the Ramah, if you build the walls out of something that's going to dry out and shrivel up and fall apart during the 7 days of Sukkot, then we look at it now as if it's dried out and shriveled up. So even though now it looks like a good doifen, we don't give it the halach of a good doifen because we look at it as if it's already shriveled up and gone. Where we discussed this halacha in the context of the schach. Now we go to Sif Bey. It's a very fascinating Sif, which we will begin today, but we will not conclude it today. Says the Mechaber, Daf nois ha-sukkah, the walls of the sukkah. Imayushtayim zu eitzel zu kimin gam. If you had two walls adjacent to each other, like this Greek letter gam, which is like a dalet. So you had two walls, 1, 2. You have two walls of a sukkah. Now we know that two walls are not enough. We learn out from a pasuk that the sukkah, at minimum, has to have 3 walls. But we also learn from a drasha that we don't need 3 complete walls. We could have 2 complete walls and then a partial wall. And what the Mechaber is going to discuss here, and what we're going to discuss at length and in detail in the Mishnah Berurah, is the makeup of this third partial wall. What does that third partial wall have to be? Now, one hakdama, one preface that you need for the proper understanding of this sif, and there's more, but the Mishnah Berurah will spread them out, but one basic thing you have to understand. Remember that the minimum size of a sukkah is Zayin Tvachim by Zayin Tvachim. 7 Tvachim by 7 Tvachim is the minimum size of the Sukkah. So when we speak about 2 complete walls, we mean 2 walls that are each 7 Tvachim long. So if you have 2 7 Tefach walls that are adjacent to each other, Kimin Gam, like this letter Gam, which is like our Dalid kind of, if that's what you have, then says the Mechaber, Oyse Doifen, you have to make an additional wall, Sheyesh Berach by Yoiser al Tefach, you have to make a panel that's slightly wider than a Tefach, Uma'amidoi, and you have to stand that board up, Bepachas Mishloisha le'echad mehadafanois, slightly less than 3 Tfachim away from one of the 2 standing walls. Now, I made a little bit of a chart over here. Those of you who learned Hilchas Eruvin together with me will remember that I'm not exactly a gifted artist, but we will try. So, what the Mechaber is discussing is over here. This over here is a complete 7 Tefach wall. See up here, I wrote 7 Tfachim. So this over here is one complete 7 Tefach wall. Then down here, we have another complete 7 Tefach wall. So here are your 2 walls that are adjacent to each other. Wall number 1 and wall number 2. Now the question is, we have to make a third wall. We're going to make a third partial wall. The Mechaber is describing to us what we need to do. The first step in the operation is, we have to put up a board. This box over here is a board. This board is going to be slightly more than a tefach wide. And we're going to stand this board up slightly less than 3 tefachim away from the end of this wall. So here we have the end of this wall. We're going to skip slightly less than 3 tefachim, is going to remain empty space. And then we're going to have this board, which is going to be slightly more than a tefach. Once we put this board up, so we had a gap slightly less than 3 tefachim, and we have a board slightly over a tefach. So then from here, from the end of this wall to the end of this board, we're going to have 4 tefachim. That's the first step in the operation, says the Mechaber. Let's read the words again. The words are, Oyse Doifen, I'm in the second line from the bottom in the middle. Oyse Doifen, we have to make a wall, that means a board, Sheyesh Berach ba Yoiser al Tefach, which is slightly more than a Tefach wide, Uma'amidai, and you're going to stand it up, says the Mechaber, Bepachos Mishloisha, slightly less than 3 Tfachim away, Le'echad me'adafanos, from the end of one of the walls. So in our case, you could do it either here, like I did in the picture, or you could do it here. You could have put the board over here, slightly less than 3 tefachim away from here. Okay, that's the first step. Then v'yamid koneh. Then you have to put up a beam. You have to put up like a lechi, where keneged akoisel, keneged oisei tefach. This koneh, this beam that you're going to put up, is going to be opposite this wall, right? It's opposite the end of this wall. It's down over here, opposite that point. That's what the Ramah means in the parentheses when he says keneged hakoisel. This beam is going to be opposite the end of the other wall, and the Mechaber continues, keneged oisei tefach. It's opposite this slightly more than a tefach board. So now it turns out that you have like this. You have empty space from here to here of slightly less than 3 tefachim. Then you have this board, which is slightly over a tefach. Then you have empty space again until you get over here where you have a lechi, where you have a koneh over here. Okay. And then the yasa letzuras haPesach. Now you're going to make a tzuras haPesach from here to here. You're going to make a tzuras haPesach. What's a tzuras haPesach? Explains the Mechaber on the top of Tzadik Beis Amud Aleph, Sheyamid koneh, you're going to put a beam, olav va'al hatefach. You're going to erect a beam, and that's this line that I made over here. You're going to make a beam that goes on top from this board to the top of this lechi. That's going to be your tzuras HaPesach. And remember, a tzuras HaPesach is just a post and a beam on top and another post. That's a tzuras HaPesach. So you're going to create a tzuras HaPesach from here to here. You're going to create a tzuras HaPesach. Ukeshera, and now this sukkah is going to be kosher. Af al pisha konesh al gabeim eino negea bahen. And this is okay, even if the beam that makes the tzuras HaPesach, the beam that goes on top from this board to this lechi, even if it's not touching the top of the board and touching the top of the lechi. Let's say this board and this lechi are 7 feet tall, and you have a beam going from above this to above this, but that beam is 12 feet up in the sky, so you have a significant gap between the overhead beam and the board and the lechi. That's okay. All right. So now the Mechaber has described to me what you need to do in order to make that partial third wall. Now we have to understand what we just read. Why does this work? Why is this okay? So let's see the Mishnah Berurah, who's going to describe this in great detail. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Vav. Beautiful Mishnah Berurah. The Chavetz Chaim did such a masterful job here. Not that the Chavetz Chaim Chas v'Chalula needs my approbation. I'm just pointing out to you the beauty of the Chavetz Chaim, the beauty of a Gadol b'Torah, a Gadol b'Halacha, the clarity with which he writes. Daf nois ha-Sukkah. Kedei lohaven heitev, in order to have a proper, good understanding of these halachos, akdim lekan kama ikarim lahalacha zu. I'm going to give you a brief hakdama to these so that you can understand these halachos. Aleph, the first hakdama. The sheer sukkah, the minimum size of a sukkah, like I spoke out, hu shetei machazekes shiva al shiva tvachim lepachos. The minimum interior size of the sukkah is 7 tvachim by 7 tvachim, and that's why the 2 complete walls that we're speaking about over here, we're talking about 2 complete walls, each one is 7 tvachim long, so that between those 2 walls, you're enclosing 7 tvachim by 7 tvachim. K'lekaman b'siman tov reish lamed daled. That's the first hakdama that the Mishnah Berurah wants to give you. Beis, what's the second hakdama? The Alfinan beGemara Mikrai, in the Gemara on Vav Amid Beis, we learn out from Sukkim, the Loikari Sukkah al Yedei Schach Levad, that a sukkah is not called a sukkah just by virtue of the overhead schach. Eli im ken yesh lo shalosh stefanos. A sukkah is not a kosher sukkah unless it has 3 walls. V'halacha l'Moshe miSinai, and we have a Kabbalah, we have a halacha l'Moshe miSinai, da'achas min ha'defanos, that one of those 3 walls does not have to be a complete wall, rather, sagi betefach echod. We have a Kabbalah, halacha l'Moshe miSinai, that one of those walls doesn't have to be complete, it could be just a tefach. The question is, what does that mean, just a tefach? Hakdama Gimel. To become Mokayim, Ba'inan Sheyenire Kedoifen. While it's true that the third wall can be constructed of only a tefach, not really only a tefach. While the third wall, in one respect, is going to have only a tefach, we still have to have the appearance of a complete third wall. And that's where things get dicey. What do we have to do in order to give the third wall an appearance of being a complete wall? Yes, we know that it doesn't actually have to be a complete wall, but we know that it has to have the appearance of a complete wall. And that's what gets tricky. What does it mean to have the appearance of a complete wall? And the Chavetz Chaim continues, Dahainu, what does this mean? Im yesh lo shtei defanois smuchos zu eitzel zu kemin daled. Now the Chavetz Chaim is going to start to give the details and describe what the Mechaber was talking about. Let's say, says the Chavetz Chaim, let's say we have 2 walls that are adjacent to each other, kimin daled, like our letter daled, right? Our little daled. You know, I keep on getting messed over by the mirror image that I see on my screen that comes out from the camera. So I'm just going to take it easy. This is upside down. I know. Fine. Don't worry about it. Kimin daled. You have 2 walls that are adjacent to each other at right angle, and each wall is 7 tvachim. Now you want to construct the third wall. Yikach daf sheyesh berachbay tefach meruvach. What you need to do, says the Mishnah Berurah, is, and he's taking this from the Mechaber that we just learned, you need to take a board that has a tefach meruvach. This board is going to be slightly over a tefach. It's not going to be precisely a tefach. It's going to be slightly over a tefach. Yikach daf, you take a board, sheyesh berach by tefach meruvach, which is a large tefach wide, which means slightly larger than a tefach wide. Dainu tefach umashahu means a tefach and a bit. V'yamidai, and you stand it up, berichuk makaim, at a distance, pachos mishloisha tvachim, slightly less than 3 tvachim, le'echad mishtei adafanois, to the end of one of the 2 walls. So, in my picture, you took your board that's slightly over a tefach, and you erected it slightly less than 3 tvachim away from this wall. Now, what does that accomplish? So the Mishnah Berurah explains, V'chol pachos min shloisha tvachim k'lavud dami. We know, and those of you remember the good old days when we were learning Hilchas Erevin, you remember that we have a din of lavud. Lavud says that when you have a gap that's less than 3 tvachim, that's considered closed. So now what we have is, since we have this board over here, and it's less than 3 tvachim away from here, now we say lavud, and it's as if this whole area is closed. Okay, let's go weiter in the Mishnah Berurah. V'nimtza, now it comes out, sheyesh kan arba tvachim. Now we have closure over here of 4 tvachim. How do we have 4 tvachim? Because this gap is slightly less than 3 tvachim. The board is slightly over a tefach. So, from the end of this wall to the outside of this beam, of this board, you now have 4 tvachim. So now we have 4 tvachim closed over here because of lavud. V'hu roiv doifen mehechsha sukkah. Oh, now that you have a 4 tefach area closed over here, 4 tvachim is a roiv of 7 tvachim. So now it turns out that here you actually have roiv of the necessary wall. The necessary wall is 7 tvachim. You have 4 tvachim. So you have roiv of the necessary wall closed up. Ukidei lahashlim shir kol hadoifen. But we said that you need the appearance of a complete third wall. So now, kidei lahashlim shir kol hadoifen, to fill out the requisite shear of a complete third wall, yasa oid tzuras haPesach. Now you're going to make a tzuras haPesach from here to the end of the wall, to the end of the 7. Dahainu, how are you going to make that tzuras haPesach? Sheyamid kane kineged oisei tefach. You're going to put up a lechi. A kana literally is a reed. It means just a narrow piece. This piece doesn't have to be slightly over a tefach. This could be just a furring strip. You're going to put up a kana over here, opposite the 1 tefach, the slightly larger than 1 tefach board. You're going to put up this kana. V'yarchik mimeno ad soif ha'kaisel, and you're going to put, where are you going to put this board? You're going to distance it from the slightly over a tefach board. You're going to put it all the way at the end over here, keneged this end. Ad soif ha'kaisel shekenegdo shemasik shivat tvachim, umeniach kane min ha'tefach ad ha'kane, and now you're going to put up a beam. You're going to put up a beam on top, min ha'tefach, from the slightly over 1 tefach board until the kane. You're going to put an overhead beam. L'mayla al gabein, above them. Oy, afil l'mayla mehen. It could even be way above them. Veder negeya behen, and it doesn't have to touch them. Rak sheyeh kenegdon, as long as the overhead beam is actually directly above the 1 tefach board and the kane. Kamavur le'el b'dinei tzuras haPesach b'siman shin samach beis, which we learned together. V'nimtza sheyesh kan doifen shalem shal shivat tvachim. Now, with all of our machinations, we have a closed wall of 7 tvachim, because from here to here is closed up using limud. That gives us 4 tvachim. And from here to here is closed up using Atzuras HaPesach. So v'nimtza sheyesh kan doifet shalem shel shiva tvachim. Va'ata, and now, says the Chavetz Chaim, naschi levayer be'ezras Hashem yisparach kol prat b'fnei atzmai. Now, says the Chavetz Chaim, that I gave you this beautiful Hagdama of Sivav, of Ois Katan Vav, where I spelled out to you precisely the mechanics of how this third wall is going to work. Now I'll break it down step by step, following the wording of the Mechaber. So now we go to Ois Katan Zayin. Ois Katan Zayin is, the Mechaber said that the first step of the operation is Ois Doifin Sheyesh Berachba Yoiser Al Tefach. We have to put up that slightly larger than 1 tefach board. That's going to be slightly less than 3 tefachim away from the end of one wall. Ois Katan Zayin. B'Magen Avram Mevur, the Magen Avram explains something very interesting. He says, Shamuta lasais tafnes hasukkah bekanim shema'amidem pachas mishloish tvachim rachayt mizeh mizeh. Chavetz Chaim brings down a very tangential point over here, and that is, we just described the din of limud. The din of limud that says that when you have 2 pieces of material that are separated from each other by less than 3 tvachim, limud says that the gap between those pieces is considered closed. Therefore, the Magen Avram says, you can make a 4-wall sukkah very easily. You could take poles, stick them into the ground so that the poles are standing upright, and position each pole slightly less than 3 tvachim away from the previous pole, and just go around and post poles and make a square. Make a square that's 7 tvachim by 7 tvachim. Now that square is not really going to be enclosed by solid walls. It's enclosed by poles that are distanced one from the other less than 3 tvachim. But limud says that the whole thing is closed. Now realize that that enclosure is paretz meruba ala amud. There's more open space than there is closed space physically. The poles could be very, very narrow. The poles could be an etzbah thick. So the poles are tiny poles, little dowels stuck into the ground. And between each dowel, you have a gap of slightly less than 3 tvachim. So this enclosure is definitely paretz meruba ala amud. Yet, the din of limud says that it's considered enclosed. It's considered that you have 4 mechitzas over here. So the Magen Avram says you can make a sukkah that way. Mutter lasais tafnes hasukkah bekanim shema'abidem pachas b'shlosh tvachim rachak zeh mizeh. But for who ba'oisekain arba tfanos, you can only do this on a 4-wall sukkah. Tahainu kanim kazer me arba ruchos. You would have to actually make 4 walls out of these dowels. But if you want to try to make the 3-wall sukkah that the Mechaber is describing over here, and you want to cheap out to the extent that you're going to make the 2 walls not solid walls, you're going to make them dowels positioned less than 3 tvachim apart, you cannot make the sukkah that the Mechaber is describing here in Sif Beis using dowels and limud. You want to use this kula, this halacha l'moshe b'sinai kula, of the 2 walls and the 3rd wall being a tefach. The 2 walls have to be solid walls. They can't be made out of dowels stuck in the ground less than 3 tvachim apart. Now there are more details to that, but we'll get to that at another time. Ois Katan Ches. So you're going to have your 2 walls. Now you're going to put up your slightly over 1 tefach board. Where are you going to put it? You have to stand it up slightly less than 3 tvachim away from the end of one wall. Da'az heavy limud. So it's within limud distance of the end of one of the walls. So now you have 4 tvachim closed. Because from the end of the wall until the slightly over 1 tefach board is less than 3 tvachim, so that's limud, that's closed. The board is slightly over a tefach. So slightly over a tefach, added to the gap that's slightly under 3 tvachim, you end up with 4 tvachim closed. Tuhu roiv heksha sukkah. And 4 tvachim is a roiv of the minimum share of the sukkah. The minimum share of the wall is 7 tfachim. 4 is roiv of 7. Now the Chavetz Chaim points out, wait a second. Why am I saying that in order to accomplish this, you need a board that's slightly over a tefach? Why? You're telling me the whole point over here is that we need roiv of the hechsher of a sukkah. Roiv of the hechsher of a sukkah, the minimum hechsher of a sukkah is 7 tfachim. What's roiv of 7? Do you need 4 to have roiv of 7? No. A drop over 3.5 is roiv of 7. So the Mishnah Berurah is bavarning over here. Why does the board have to be slightly over a tefach? Let the board be a regular tefach. So the gap was slightly under 3 tefachim. The board will be 1 tefach. So now you're slightly under 4 tefachim. Slightly under 4 tefachim is still roiv of 7. So why does the board have to be 1 tefach and a bit? Why can't it be exactly 1 tefach? So the Mishnah Berurah explains. Why am I telling you that the board, why is the Mechaber telling you that the board has to be slightly over a tefach? Why? If what you're trying to accomplish is to have roiv of the wall closed, so it could be slightly under 4 tefachim. So make a 1 tefach board. So slightly under 3 tefachim open space, a tefach of a board gives you slightly under 4 tefachim closed. To have a tvei b'shloisha tefachim u'mechza, that's more than 3.5 tefachim, so that's a roiv of 7. Achein, mishum debatzer me'arba tefachim, however, explains the Chavetz Chaim, if you do that, then your closed space is going to be under 4. It's true that it's still roiv of 7, because it's over 3.5, but it's under 4. The Mishnah Berurah says under 4 is a non-starter. Mishum de batzer me'arba tefachim, since lamaisa at the end of the day it's under 4 tefachim, like choshev b'shum duchta. Under 4 tefachim cannot be considered a mechitza. The minimum share of a mechitza has to be 4 tefachim. We never find a significant mechitza that's under 4 tefachim. Lahachi yitzrichu tefach meruvach. That's why we need that this 1 tefach board is not a 1 tefach board, it's slightly over 1 tefach. That way, between the open space that was slightly under 3 tefachim and the board which is slightly over a tefach, you have closed space of 4 tefachim. It's a roiv of 7, and it's also 4 tefachim, which is the minimum for a mechitza. Ice cotton test, keneged hakoisel. Then you're going to take a koneh, you're going to take a lechi, and you're going to put up that lechi over here, right? That lechi is going to be over here. Now the words of the Ramah are that this beam, this koneh, is keneged hakoisel. It's opposite the wall. Which wall is he talking about? He's talking about this wall. This koneh is opposite 2 things. It's opposite the slightly over a tefach board, and it's also opposite this wall. Says the Mishnah Berurah, keneged hakoisel. What does that mean, opposite the wall? Hainu keneged soif hamiktsaya hasheni. It means it's opposite the end of the other wall. Shalakoisel shekenegdai, the wall that's opposite it. Shestamai machzik shivat tvachim. That wall was also a 7 tefach wall. V'yesh oimrim. Now the Mishnah Berurah says an interesting thing. V'yesh oimrim, there are those that say that this beam should actually be the yarchiku oy tefach yoser. It should actually be outside the enclosure of the 2 walls by 1 tefach. So it should not be directly opposite this end. This wall is 7 tefachim. If it would be directly opposite this corner, right? If it would be directly opposite there, it would be exactly 7 tefachim away from here. This Yesh Ayrim says that it should be 1 tefach more to the outside. It should be out here. Why? The Yesh Ayrim de'achikoi tefach yoser kedei sheyeh atzuras haPesach al arba tefachim. Because we want that this tzuras haPesach, the upper beam that's over this lechi and this board, we want it to be over 4 tefachim. We don't want it, if it's like this, it's not over 4 tefachim. Because remember, from here to here is 4 tefachim. This whole thing is 7 tefachim. So that the overhead beam, the tzuras haPesach, is not a 4 tefach tzuras haPesach. It's slightly under 4 tefachim. So we should position this outside so that this should be 4 tefachim. Ois cotton yud v'yasel tzuras haPesach, and now we're making a tzuras Pesach. Why are we making this tzuras haPesach? Kedei lahashlim shir hakoisel, because now we filled out that whole third wall between the limud and the slightly over a tefach board and the tzuras haPesach. We now have a complete third wall. V'ayin bebach shekosav dezeu midrabanan. The Bach says that this requirement is only midrabanan. Aval tefach meruvach shamarnu mitchila hu midaraisa. The Bach is really answering a very strong kasha over here. The halacha l'Moshe b'Sinai told me that the third wall is only a tefach, but this whole process that we just described is more than a tefach. It's a board that's slightly over a tefach, then it's a lechi, it's an overhead beam. So what do you mean the halacha l'Moshe b'Sinai tells me that the third wall could be only a tefach? It's not true. It needs a tefach, it needs a tzuras haPesach, it needs a tefach here, it needs a beam here. So the Bach explains that these extra requirements of the tzuras haPesach, that's a d'Rabbanan. Midaraisa, all you need is that slightly over a tefach board and the limud. That's all you need midaraisa to make the third wall. Okay, we have one more Mishnah Berurah here, is cutting Yud Aleph, on what we learned today, but we'll have to pick that up tomorrow. Okay, thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schos of limud HaTorah should be megan on Gans Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should send Yeshuas, Refuas, and Parnasa to all those in need, and we should be zeicher to see the Bias Gal Tzedek, B'meher V'Yameinu. Amen. Be well.